The first thing I saw that morning was my peach tree laying sideways in the mud, roots sticking out of the ground like somebody had ripped it out with their bare hands. For a second, I honestly thought a storm had come through overnight, and I'd somehow slept through it. But then I heard the backup alarm from an excavator and looked toward the center of the yard. That's when I saw three construction guys standing right in the middle of my garden drinking coffee like they owned the place. One of them actually waved at me. I remember just standing there on the back porch in my socks, coffee still in my hand, trying to process what I was looking at. Half my raised beds were gone. The herb strip I'd spent years building along the fence had been carved open by a trench almost 4 feet wide, and there was this giant black drainage pipe sitting across my lawn like the body of some dead animal. Now maybe this sounds dramatic if you're not a gardening person, but that backyard meant something to me. I bought that house in Belcrest County about 8 years earlier, right after my divorce, back when everything in my life felt loud and ugly and unfinished. The place itself wasn't much. Small single-story ranch home, faded siding, old mailbox leaning sideways like it had given up on life. But the backyard, I don't know, it felt quiet. Empty, but quiet. At the time, it was just patchy dirt and weeds with a busted chain-link fence running along the back edge of the property. Most people would have looked at it and seen work. I looked at it and saw somewhere I could disappear for a while. So over the years, little by little, I built that garden myself. No landscapers, no fancy contractor, just me after work and on weekends hauling bags of soil in the back of my old Tacoma. I laid stone borders one summer during a heat wave so bad I nearly passed out twice. I built cedar raised beds after watching YouTube tutorials at 2 in the morning because I had no clue what I was doing. I planted rosemary, thyme, mint, tomatoes, strawberries, even managed to keep 2 dwarf lemon trees alive through a winter everybody said would kill them. And weirdly enough, the garden kind of rebuilt me too. My neighbor Gloria used to joke that she could track my mental health based on how straight my tomato rows were. She was 72, lived uphill from me, and spent most afternoons spying on the neighborhood through her kitchen blinds like a retired FBI agent. Sweet woman though, brutally honest. About a year before all this happened, she told me something that stuck in my head. We were standing by the fence while I fixed an irrigation line, and she said, "You know why people get mean when they deal with property lines?" I shrugged, and she goes, "Because land makes people feel powerful, even tiny pieces of it." At the time I laughed. Turns out she was right. The foreman eventually walked over while I was still standing there staring at the trench through my garden. Tall guy, wraparound sunglasses, orange safety vest, probably late 40s. He handed me a folded permit sheet like he'd done this speech 100 times before. "County drainage project," he said. "Runoff issue from the upper streets." I looked down at the paperwork and sure enough, there was an official county seal stamped right across the top. According to the documents, they were installing a new stormwater line downhill toward Miller Creek because the streets higher up the hill had been flooding during heavy rainstorms. And technically, part of the line crossed my property. Now here's the important part. The approved easement was supposed to run along the very back edge of my lot, near this rocky strip nobody ever used because digging there was miserable. Solid hardpan and roots everywhere. But the trench they'd actually dug cut right through the center of my garden instead. I pointed at the plans and said, "This isn't where the easement is." The foreman barely even looked. "Yeah," he said, "we adjusted the route a little." A little. I remember laughing when I said it because I genuinely couldn't believe the confidence this guy had. "You tore through the middle of my yard." He shrugged. Actually shrugged. "The original route's full of rock. This was faster." That sentence sat in my chest all day like a brick. This was faster. Not safer. Not better. Faster. I asked him who approved the change, and he gave me this look people use when they think you're about to become a problem. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice a little. "The pipe still ends up in the same place. You'll barely notice it once the grass grows back." Grass. Like he was talking about a patch of weeds instead of 6 years of work. By sunset they were gone. The trench had been filled back in, but the yard looked butchered. Mud everywhere. Broken irrigation tubing sticking out of the soil. My peach tree tossed sideways near the fence like trash waiting for pickup. That night I sat alone on the back steps with a beer, staring at what used to be my garden while rain clouds rolled over the hills, and for the first time in a long time, I felt that old divorce-era anger creeping back in. That feeling where somebody bigger than you makes a decision, and you're just expected to swallow it quietly because fighting back feels pointless. But the thing about spending years rebuilding your life piece by piece, eventually you stop letting people bulldoze it without a fight. The next morning I called the county engineering office, mostly because I wanted somebody to at least acknowledge what they'd done. I wasn't even thinking revenge at that point. Honestly, I just wanted someone official to say, yeah, this got handled badly. But the woman on the phone sounded exhausted before I finished my second sentence. She transferred me 3 times. By the 4th person, I was explaining the situation again while standing in my destroyed backyard, looking at muddy boot prints where my herb beds used to be. Finally, some assistant project coordinator told me, in the politest possible government voice, that the contractor had field discretion during utility installation. Field discretion. That phrase irritated me almost as much as this was faster. I said, so they can just ignore the approved route? No, sir, she replied carefully. Minor adjustments are sometimes necessary depending on conditions. I looked down at a dead basil plant half buried in clay and said, well, they made a pretty major adjustment. She promised someone would review the matter, which I already knew meant absolutely nothing. A week later, the county inspector signed off on the project. That part really got under my skin, because once that happened, everybody involved started acting like the situation was finished. Done deal. Move on. One afternoon, I even caught the foreman driving by slowly in his company truck, glancing toward my yard like he was checking whether I'd given up yet. Gloria noticed too. She came over carrying a pie she claimed was peach, but tasted mostly like bourbon, and said, that man's got the smuggest face I've seen since Nixon. I laughed harder than I had all week. Then she asked a question that changed everything. You actually read those plans yet? I told her I'd skimmed them. No, she said, pointing her fork at me. I mean really read them. So that night, I spread the permit documents across my kitchen table and started going through every page carefully. Structural notes, grading specifications, soil compaction requirements, drainage calculations, page after page of engineering language that looked boring enough to cure insomnia. But after about an hour, something started standing out. The approved design depended heavily on ground stability. The original easement route along the rocky back edge wasn't chosen randomly. That section of land had dense compacted soil underneath the surface, the kind that stays stable under heavy water flow. My garden, on the other hand, had soft cultivated soil because I'd spent years loosening and enriching it for planting. In simple terms, they'd installed a major storm pipe in the absolute worst ground possible. And then I noticed something else. The approved plans specifically required layered gravel reinforcement beneath the pipe due to seasonal runoff pressure from the hillside. But when they dug through my yard, I never saw gravel trucks. Never saw compaction equipment either. They dug the trench, dropped the pipe in, covered it, and left. That's when the whole thing shifted in my head. This wasn't just disrespectful. This was lazy. Dangerously lazy. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I walked the trench line again, this time paying attention to the ground itself. Certain spots had already started settling unevenly, creating shallow dips in the soil where water would naturally collect. Near the center of the yard, one section actually squished slightly under my boots. That pipe had only been underground for 8 days. I took photos, dozens of them. Then I filed a formal complaint directly with County Engineering Compliance instead of the general office. Different department. Different tone entirely. Suddenly people started calling me back. A senior inspector named Daniel Mercer contacted me 2 days later. Calm voice, sounded older, the kind of guy who probably alphabetizes his garage tools. He asked if I could walk him through the property in person. The inspection happened on a Thursday afternoon right before a major storm system rolled into the county. Dark clouds moving in, wind picking up, air smelling like wet asphalt. Mercer showed up wearing a tan rain jacket carrying a clipboard thick enough to stop bullets. The contractor's foreman was there too. Apparently, he'd been notified after my complaint escalated. The second I saw him leaning against his truck smiling like this was all some giant inconvenience, my blood pressure went through the roof. Mercer started by comparing the site against the approved plans. Quiet guy. Methodical. He walked the property slowly while occasionally kneeling to measure elevations and soil depth. Meanwhile, the foreman kept trying to steer the conversation. Ground conditions changed during excavation, he said casually. Route adjustment was necessary. Mercer didn't even look up. Was the adjustment documented? The foreman hesitated. Not formally. That tiny pause right there. That was the first crack. Rain started about 20 minutes into the inspection. Light at first, just enough to darken the soil. Then it got heavier. Mercer asked us to stay while he checked runoff behavior around the trench line. At this point, even Gloria was watching from her kitchen window like it was the Super Bowl. And that's when the yard started telling the truth. Water began pooling near the center section almost immediately. You could actually see the soil sinking unevenly as runoff flowed downhill from the neighboring properties. The trench line turned darker than the surrounding ground, like a scar reopening under pressure. Mercer crouched near one low spot and pressed his boot into the mud. Water surfaced instantly around the sole. The foreman stopped smiling. A few minutes later we heard it. This deep, hollow, gurgling sound under the ground. Not loud at first, just wrong. Mercer looked uphill toward the street drains while rain hammered against our jackets. Water should have been flowing cleanly downhill through the system toward Miller Creek. Instead, runoff started slowing near the upper curb inlets. Then muddy water suddenly burped backward out of one of the storm drains up the hill. The foreman muttered, "Ah, hell." Mercer immediately asked for excavation depth records. Nobody had them. That was the moment the whole atmosphere changed. You could feel it. Until then, this had been an irritated homeowner complaining about yard damage. But now the county inspector was staring at evidence that a public drainage system might actually fail during heavy storms because somebody cut corners to save half a day of digging. Rain kept pounding harder. The trench line in my backyard began sinking visibly now, inch by inch, creating a shallow depression straight through the middle of what used to be my tomato beds. Water collected faster than the pipe could move it, because the soil beneath had already started shifting. Mercer finally stood up and looked directly at the foreman. "You installed this in uncompacted cultivation soil?" Nobody answered. That silence said everything. Then came the line I still think about sometimes. Mercer shook rainwater off his clipboard and said, almost under his breath, "You traded long-term stability for short-term convenience." Even the foreman looked embarrassed after that. By evening, county engineering had halted the project pending emergency review. Barricades went up along the uphill street because the drainage backup was now creating flooding risks during storms. And suddenly the same people who ignored me for 2 weeks were calling nonstop. One county administrator actually asked if I'd be willing to remain patient while corrective options were explored. I almost laughed into the phone, because patience was exactly what built that garden in the first place. And now patience was about to cost them a fortune. By the following Monday, the whole neighborhood knew about the pipe. Not the garden, the pipe. That's how these things go in suburban communities. Nobody pays attention when somebody quietly spends years building something beautiful, but the second a government project starts failing in public, suddenly everybody becomes an expert. People stood around at mailboxes discussing soil compaction like they had engineering degrees. The local Facebook group turned into a war zone overnight. Half the neighborhood blamed the contractor. The other half blamed me. Apparently, I was now the guy holding up flood prevention infrastructure because of some tomatoes. That one actually came from a real comment online. Gloria printed it out and taped it to my mailbox because she thought it was hilarious. But behind all the gossip, the county was panicking. See, the problem wasn't just my yard anymore. The storm system uphill had already shown signs of backup during one rainstorm, and weather reports were predicting an even larger system coming in the next week. If that drainage line failed completely, several streets uphill could flood. So county engineering moved fast. 3 days after the inspection, they held an emergency review meeting with the contractor, inspectors, and a geotechnical consultant. I wasn't technically supposed to attend, but Mercer called me personally and said, "You should probably hear this yourself." That sentence alone told me things were bad. The meeting happened inside one of those ugly municipal buildings with fluorescent lighting that somehow makes everyone look guilty. I sat near the back while the contractor's management team crowded around a folding table covered in revised site maps. And for the first time since this whole thing started, the foreman looked nervous. Not annoyed. Nervous. A geotechnical engineer walked everyone through the findings. According to soil samples, the cultivated ground beneath my garden retained far more moisture than the native compacted earth along the approved easement. Once heavy runoff saturated the trench, the unsupported soil underneath the pipe began shifting unevenly, creating pressure points that disrupted water flow. Basically, exactly what the original plans were designed to prevent. Then came the part that really buried them. Mercer revealed that the route deviation had never been officially submitted for approval. No amended plans. No engineering review. No signed authorization. The contractor had simply changed the route in the field because digging through the rocky easement would have taken longer and cost more. You could actually feel the temperature in the room change after that. One county official leaned back in his chair and muttered, "Jesus Christ." The contractor's project manager tried defending the decision, said they were under scheduling pressure, equipment timing, labor constraints, all the usual corporate language people use when they want shortcuts to sound strategic. Mercer shut him down immediately. "I don't care if you were late for Christmas dinner," he said. "You do not reroute public infrastructure through unstable ground without authorization." Dead silence. And honestly, that was the moment I finally felt vindicated. Not because I wanted revenge exactly, but because somebody in authority finally said the thing I'd been screaming into the void for weeks. They didn't ruin my yard by accident. They ruined it because they decided my property was the easiest place to cut corners. By the end of the meeting, the county issued a full excavation order. The entire pipe section crossing my property had to be removed and rebuilt along the original approved easement, which meant they had to dig everything back up. Again, the irony was almost poetic. About 4 days later, the crew returned to my house. Same trucks, same equipment, same foreman. Except this time nobody looked relaxed. No music playing, no joking around. They moved like people attending a funeral. The foreman walked up to me before work started, hands shoved in his vest pockets, eyes tired. "I guess you got what you wanted," he muttered. And I remember looking past him toward the ruined yard before answering. "No," I said. "I wanted my garden left alone." That hit him harder than if I'd yelled. For a second, he just stood there nodding slightly, like he knew I was right, but hated hearing it out loud. Then they started excavating. Again. Only this time they followed the actual easement route along the rocky rear edge of the property exactly like the plans originally required. And sure enough, digging there looked miserable. Sparks occasionally jumped from the excavator bucket, hitting buried rock. Progress slowed to almost nothing some days. Which explained everything. The shortcut through my garden had never been about necessity. It was about convenience. And convenience got expensive. The contractor ended up eating the cost of the entire reconstruction. New excavation, new reinforcement base, new inspections, environmental review, restoration work. I later heard through Mercer that the total overrun climbed well into 6 figures. All because somebody wanted to save time. As part of the settlement, the county also required full restoration of my backyard. Not just basic grass replacement either. Actual restoration, new raised beds, replacement irrigation, fresh topsoil, tree compensation. A landscaping crew spent nearly 2 weeks rebuilding what had been destroyed. Weirdly though, the yard didn't feel the same afterward. Cleaner maybe, newer, but different. One evening after everything was finally finished, I sat outside watching water move quietly through the corrected drainage line during a light rainstorm. No flooding, no backup, just smooth flow downhill where it was always supposed to go. Gloria came over carrying another terrible pie and sat beside me under the patio cover. "You know," she said, "half the neighborhood thinks you're a hero, and the other half," she grinned, "think you're a vindictive lunatic." Honestly, I couldn't even argue with either side, because the truth is, this whole thing stopped being about the garden somewhere in the middle of it all. It became about something bigger that I think a lot of people understand deep down. That feeling when somebody with power decides your time, your work, your space. None of it matters compared to their convenience. And maybe the uncomfortable part is this. If I hadn't pushed back, they probably would have gotten away with it. The pipe might have failed years later after everybody involved had moved on. Another contractor would have blamed erosion. Taxpayers would have covered repairs. And my yard would have just become collateral damage nobody remembered. Instead, they had to answer for it immediately. Still, every now and then I wonder whether I escalated things too far. Whether I should have just accepted the damage and moved on like people expected me to. Maybe life would have been quieter if I had. But then I remember the foreman standing in my garden saying, "This was faster." And somehow that still bothers me more than the trench ever did. So now I'm curious what you think. If somebody destroys years of your work because it's more convenient for them, and you discover they violated the rules to do it, do you fight back even if it costs everyone millions and turns the community against itself? Or do you let it go? Let me know in the comments, because honestly, people around here still argue about it.